So now that we know how to animate in Toon Boom Harmony and arrange frames, let's create a new animation completely from scratch. So in my new scene, I'm going to first start off by importing my files by going up to File, Import, and Images. And I'm going to import both my background and my seagull reference. So the background I select is a Photoshop document. So when I press OK, it's going to give me a dialog that says my file has multiple layers, and I can import it as a single layer, or I could import it as multiple layers. So when I select separated layers, I make sure to set the transparency to straight so it keeps the same transparency on the file. And then when it imports, you can see that every single layer from my Photoshop document has imported. Then, to organize these files, I'm going to Shift Select to select all my layers, and I'm going to right click and say Group Selection. Then I'm going to minimize that group, and that way all of my layers only take up one space on my timeline. Then, to rename this group, I'm going to right click it and go to Layer Properties, and here I can enter the name of my group, which I'm going to call BG-G for group. So currently my background is not matching my scene, so I want to scale it up. But if I try to use my transform tool and scale up this drawing, it's not going to work. So what I need to do is attach a peg to my group by clicking this peg button down here, so I can move my entire group. And what a peg is you can think of it as sort of a handle on your animation layer, so you can use it to transform or move your layer around. We'll discuss pegs further in the character rigging tutorial. Next, I want to extend my background layer. So if I click on the last frame, you can see that it's blank. So I'm going to press F5 so that my background holds for the entire length of my scene. Then I'm going to import our seagull again by using File, Import, Images. And since the seagull is just a flat PNG, it'll import as just one layer. And then with the same transform tool, I'm going to transform it in place. And I'll put it about where I want it on the scene. So on my blank drawing layer, I'm going to start my animation. So I'm going to turn on my light bulb in my camera view, and when I switch to my brush, it'll fade out all of my reference. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trace the PNG that I've already imported. One, this helps me get familiar with drawing the character, and two, it gives me a vector drawing that I can use with my frame-by-frame animation. And then I'll draw out some thumbnails of what I want to happen in the shot. Since these are thumbnails, they're super scribbly, and I can delete them and start over, which I do a lot. Then I'll use the imported drawings to reference the bigger shapes, like his belly and his head. You could almost treat him like a beanbag with sort of a ping pong ball for a head. And sometimes I'll draw contour lines over the 3D shape, so I can get a better idea of volume and direction of the character. I'm keeping it super simple, so if I need to delete anything and start over, it's not a big deal. In fact, you'll see me start over several times here before I start getting drawings that I kinda like. Once I get into a flow, I'll continue working along, imagining how the shot might progress in slow motion, and drawing those frames next. Framing forwards and backwards constantly so I can kind of feel where the motion's gonna go. And I'm also starting out with just single drawings, so I don't have these timed out at all, and it makes it super easy to flip them back and forth. I'll worry about timing later. Once I'm happy with these simple drawings, I'll time them out by extending my animation layer to fill the length of the scene, and then I'll drag my frames around until I'm happy with the timing. Then I'll work on the next pass, which is his wings. By figuring out one part at a time, starting with the main important bodies, which you can copy and paste quickly to block in movement, then adding the extra stuff on top using new layers, this can be a very methodical way to work and is especially useful for flowy or floppy bits like hair or a tail. And then once I'm done with all of those steps, I'll call this my rough animation, and I'll put it into a group. Then I'll create a new layer called Seagull Cleanup, and I'll use all of my rough drawings as reference. And I'll go through and do what's called a cleanup pass, where I put the character more on model and also draw the final line work that's going to appear in the animation. When this is all finished, then we have an outlined version of our animation. Now we can color it. Here I have my reference seagull image, which is a PNG, so I actually don't have any vector colors to choose from here. So I'll have to create a palette and import them using the color picker. So to create a new palette, I'm going to go over to my color window, and if you don't see that, it's under Windows and Color. So on the top part of the window, you can see our palettes, and the first one is just the default palette. And then at the bottom here, we see our colors. So I'm going to create a new palette by clicking this plus button up here where the palettes window is, and I'll name it Seagull. Press OK, and you can now see we have only one default color located here. If I switch back to my first scene, I can see all my original colors. So back in our seagull palette, we want to add a new color for each one of these parts. So to make a new color under my palette, I'm going to click this plus button under where my swatches are, and that'll create a new swatch based on what I have selected. So since I only had the black color selected, it created a new black color. To rename it, I double click on the name, and to change the color, I double click on the color box. So now that we have our color picker window open, we can use this eyedropper tool to select a color from our PNG that we imported. So if I click on my eyedropper tool, it'll give me a message saying drag the dropper to the desired color and release. So the way the eyedropper tool works is you have to click and hold and then navigate your mouse where you want it to select from and let go. So we want white, so I'm going to use the eyedropper tool on his white highlight here. And then when I'm happy with my color, I click the close button and we now have a new white color. So I'm going to repeat that step by clicking plus, renaming it, double clicking on the color box to select my color, using my eyedropper and selecting the color I want and letting go, and then closing that. And I'll just repeat this step over and over until I've got all the colors that I want. So you can see here my color swatches get kind of crowded. So there's actually a different way to view these. If we click under this little icon here with 3 lines, and then go to colors and select swatch mode, it'll compress our swatches so it's a little bit easier to see all your colors at once. So that's how to create a new palette. I'd recommend creating a palette for each character in your scene. That way you don't have too many colors in one palette. Now that we have all the colors that we're going to use, let's paint our animation. So when we're ready to color our animation in Advanced or Premium, we could just take our paint bucket and just fill in the colors with the colors we want. Just like that, pretty simple. But in Advanced and Premium, there's actually a different technique that is really useful to know. And it involves using these art layers, which are over here on the right. And by default, it shows line art and color art. So you can think of these art layers as individual layers within the frame itself. So right now I'm on my line art layer, which makes sense because this is our line art. If I go to my color art layer, I can take my paintbrush, select a color and fill it in. And you'll see because it's the color art layer, that is below our line art layer. So our line art is appearing on top of our colors. So in order to use this color art layer, we go to our black arrow tool and we select this button right here, create color art from line art layer. So I click that and it looks like nothing happened. But if we switch to our color art layer by clicking the C over here, you'll see invisible strokes where our line art is. So now what I can do is I can take my paint bucket and fill in my colors, and it will appear under the line art. If you ever have any gaps in your line, you can tell because these nodes will appear yellow instead of dark blue like they are here. If you have a gap in your line art, you can use this close gap tool and just draw a simple little line, and it'll close that gap, and now you can fill it in. So that's how you use the color art layer. But right now we're just doing this on one frame. I want to apply that same color art action to my entire animation. So what I need to do is I need to select my black arrow tool and toggle this option on, apply to multiple drawings. And what that does is whenever this is toggled, whatever action I do will apply to my entire animation. So if I have that toggled on and I click my create color art from line art button, I can now switch to my color art layer and see that every single frame now has those invisible strokes on it. So I'm going to do one more thing. So since this is all transparent, I want to fill in the entire animation with one color to start out with. So I'm going to take my paint bucket tool, and again in our paint bucket tool we have this apply to multiple drawings option. So I'm going to toggle that on, and I'm going to select the color we see the most, which is this feathers 1 color right here. And I'm going to zoom out so I make sure to select my whole animation, and I'm going to draw a big circle. So with this apply to all drawings, you can see our animation has now filled in. There are some spots where it didn't quite fill it in, so you can take your paint bucket and turn on this close gap option, and just fill in manually any spots where it didn't fill in. You'll notice in some spots, like here, in between his legs it's filled in a color, because this is a closed shape, but it's not what we want. So we can either click our black arrow tool, select that shape and press delete, or we can take our paint bucket and use the unpaint tool and just click any of those negative spaces. For any spots where there's no line art to separate my colors, I'm going to use my stroke tool and just separate that section on his back here. And then I'll take my paint bucket and I'll fill it in with the color it's supposed to be. Then I'm going to go through my whole animation and just click and fill until the entire thing is done. Usually when I'm working on coloring, I'll work on one color at a time. So it depends on the project, but usually I'll go through sort of a assembly line style and do one color at a time. And now we have our animation all painted in. So now that we've gone over frame by frame animation, let's talk about doing puppeted animation.